The Sociology of Freedom. Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization. Volume 3. Written by Abdullah Öcalan. Chapter 8. Democratic Modernity versus Capitalist Modernity. The research methods used by the Eurocentric social sciences for investigating truth are quintessentially hegemonic. They make alternative paths of truth virtually impossible in two fundamental ways. The first is the monistic universalist approach. The truth is always reduced to one. The second is the infinite relativist model. To say that everyone has a truth of their own is essentially to say that there is no truth. This is like saying that everything changes in order to prove that nothing changes. It is clear that both methods have reductionism in common. They openly reflect their character by reducing truth to one, whether through universalist monism or relativist singularism. Undoubtedly, civilizational monopolism lies behind these methods. Its foundations date back to when the Sumerian priests constructed En as the greatest god. The reason for exalting En was the need to legitimize the emerging hierarchy and monopolism of the city, class, and state, and to make them dominant and hegemonic in social mentality. First cause in Greek philosophy, God as the greatest invention, has the same source. In monotheistic religions, the form assumed by En is Allah, the God of all worlds. El has its roots in Ella. El became Jupiter with the emergence of Rome. The attempt to use such religions or mythological concepts to legitimize the construction of god-kings and imperial regimes in any society can be widely observed. Almost all kingdoms, empires, and despotic regimes endeavor to use such concepts to exalt themselves and attain ideological hegemony. Without this hegemony, these regimes are unlikely to survive. During its 16th century ascension, European capitalist monopolism, as civilization's new hegemonic center and form, was clearly aware that it would not achieve dominance without a similar effort. Money capital, which until then had hidden itself in the cracks and back rooms of society, began for the first time to rise above society as a hegemonic force and gradually infiltrated its every pore. The search for new method by Roger Bacon, Francis Bacon, and René Descartes, who had their roots in Christian and therefore Middle Eastern Sumerian theology, was closely connected to this material hegemonic rise. The truth they were pursuing, whether in method or content, had a share in this new kind of capital and its hegemonic rise. As capitalist monopoly consolidated its hegemony, it also consolidated and perpetuated its ideological hegemony. We can only provide a scientific explanation of the new revolutions in method, philosophy, and science by looking at the transformative effects of these material conditions. No doubt, attributing everything to capitalism leads to scientific blindness and would fall into a trap and into the most vulgar reductionism. But if we ignore the importance of the connections between them, the exploration of truth will be crippled and lose its value amid metaphysical narratives. In explaining the concept of modernity, it is necessary and very instructive to take the formation of this methodology and truth into account. Modernity as a concept means time, the present. There are different moderns, depending on the age, from Sumerian modernity to Roman modernity, and even before and after them, there have been and are many examples of modernity. Who could deny that at a certain time, Roman modernity was proudly lived in all centers of civilization? Are we not in awe when the archaeological records tell us that the Sumerians, and even before them, Upper Mesopotamians, presented perhaps the most spectacular examples of modernity in terms of time and scope? Could we explain these revolutionary material cultures if they were not charged with meaning? When Anthony Giddens emphasizes the difference between capitalist modernity and all other modernities, he contributed to explaining the truth to a certain extent. Obviously, it is possible to understand Giddens' perspective. He is, after all, a child of English hegemony. To claim that capitalist modernity is unprecedented is a sort of debt to, or worship of their country and the new god, the nation-state, required of any contemporary intellectual. His description of the three pillars on which capitalist modernity rests is quite instructive. But he separates modernity from capitalism and treats it as a superior category. As a result, he clearly adopts the singularity attitude that dominates the methodology of social sciences. He does not want to give any other kind of modernity a chance. If there is a modernity, then it is unprecedented. Two kinds of modernity cannot exist simultaneously. This is the mentality that dominates all schools of the social sciences, whether left, right, or center. No leftist intellectual, including Karl Marx, doubted the singularity of modernity, or that this modernity was European. Center and right-wing intellectuals, the liberal intellectuals, were sure that it represented the last word of truth. It is only recently that different postmodern discourses have begun to surface. Nietzsche's critique of modernity is important. Religious critiques of modernity, on the other hand, are only possibly meaningful from the point of view of their own modernity. Michael Foucault's assertion that modernity results in the death of man is important, but insufficient. Real socialism, on the other hand, despite assertions to the contrary, never thought of representing a different modernity, either theoretically or practically. While spokespersons for real socialism often claimed to represent a new civilization, they were referring to development and competition with capitalism in all areas. They thought they were closer to the basic templates and pillars of capitalist modernity than capitalism itself, and thus declared it their primary task to overtake the capitalist system. The real socialist experiments, particularly in Russia and China, quickly proved to be the fresh blood needed by capitalist modernity. The primary goal of all of the national liberation movements, seen as the peak of success, was to catch up with the dominant modernity as quickly as possible, thereby achieving a happy life. No one really doubted this theoretical and practical orientation. However, if the content and form of the last 400 years of dominant modernity is examined, we will not only conclude that this is just the most recent manifestation of the times of the last 5,000 years of civilization. At the same time, it will be easy to analyze once we see that they go hand in glove and are links in a chain. With my defense, whether in this volume or in the two previous volumes, I tried to shatter this understanding of a singular, universal modernity, and to prove that an alternative to the dominant modernity always exists, and despite all attempts to suppress and disguise it, continues to exist in all its forms and contents as one side of a dialectical pair of opposites. Democratic civilization, given that civilization corresponds to the concepts of time, era, and modernity, may be inadequate as a name and could be criticized extensively. But when I considered the historical society nature of society and visualized the movements that represent the carriers of the history of clans, ashirets, tribes, peoples, religious communities, and similar communities, I could neither emotionally nor intellectually designate these movements as barbarian or as religious reactionaries. After I realized with a certainty that dialectics do not necessarily function through opposing poles bent on each other's destruction, it was no longer difficult to establish that civilization is not a monistic, but a dichotomous process in the non-destructive dialectical development of historical society. Although under very difficult conditions and poorly equipped, I have attempted to present my ideas in these volumes. What both amazes and infuriates me is that despite being fully equipped to do so, Eurocentric social scientists have not tried to systematize this dichotomous state of civilization as two different modernities. Let's take another look at what the three fundamental factors of Anthony Giddens' modernity entails, and what responses its antithesis, the concept of democratic modernity, offers. Deconstructing capitalism and modernity. According to Anthony Giddens, capitalism first appeared in Europe. An overwhelming number of Eurocentric social scientists hold a similar view. According to them, in no other period and location in history was such a development seen. The capitalism referred to here is the capitalism that arose as the world hegemonic power center in 16th century Dutch-English capitalism, with Amsterdam and London as its hub. There is some truth in this, in that subsequently Amsterdam and London took over the hegemony of the classical global center of civilization from this century onward. The question of how this shift in hegemony occurred is the subject of an extremely large body of literature dealing with this phase of world history. I cannot and need not repeat all this here. I will simply remind you to keep it in mind. I touched upon these issues in the previous two volumes. What is more important is what remains incomplete and incorrect about this observation. A. The assertion that capitalism is singular is simply incorrect. I have presented a comprehensive analysis that shows that the first capital monopoly arose in the Sumerian priest's temple. In this context, we can comfortably conclude that we owe the formation of the city, class, and state triad as the first hegemonic monopoly to the Sumerians. After I encountered the views of André Gunder Frank and his friends who share his way of thinking about central civilization and the world system, I felt particularly strengthened in my views. But I emphatically argue that the monopoly of power represents another form of capital monopoly. I have stressed that the importance of grasping that power is one of the four main forms of accumulation. The first monopoly was established over agriculture, which was becoming more productive. The surplus product necessitated trade, allowing a trade monopoly to develop. In addition, the first industrial monopoly was established over craftspeople in the city and temple. The city administration, on the other hand, had taken on military and administrative tasks. It worked closely with three previously mentioned monopolies to form a strong monopoly of power. The unequal distribution of power among them necessitated hegemonic relations. Initially, the priests were the main hegemonic power, but that eventually changed. In short, both monopoly and a hegemonic character already existed in the founding phase. In the two previous volumes, I roughly traced the historical course of these developments. Another very important observation is that no matter how much internal conflict exists among them, monopolies within civilization react to external forces in a united way and historically behave like the links of a chain. No civilization would have developed without the legacy of the previous ones. I'm talking here about the Central Civilization system, not the Chinese or Incan civilizations. I had also tried to present in detail the story of the formation of the European link in the chain. I especially emphasized its relationship with Eastern civilization and the role of Venice in transferring these values for over 3 centuries. it could be claimed that the highly advanced quality of money capital was a singularity of European civilization after the 16th century. Undoubtedly, from this century onward, the money capital monopoly succeeded in establishing its hegemony in Europe. It is possible to speak of a singularity, or being unprecedented in this sense, but clearly it is not possible to conclude that Europe is the homeland of money capital, or that it emerged for the first time during this era. Other items that were used in a similar way to money existed long before the civilization. Experts researching antiquity agree that obsidian and other similar materials were the first to assume the role of money. Various valuable materials still play a similar role in primitive communal societies. We know that the first coins were minted by the Kingdom of Lydia on the eastern shore of the Aegean Sea around 560 BCE, and that they were made of gold and silver and bore the image of Croesus. The same is true of money capital accumulation. Accumulation is a very old tradition. Valuable metals and goods have been accumulated throughout history in this sense. Archaeological records offer plenty of examples, and the old expression, as rich as Croesus, also bears witness to this reality. But nothing can tell the story of the use of money capital to produce profit in such an original and attractive way as the Assyrian Karum. There were many cities in the East that were home to money capital thousands of years before Venice, Amsterdam, and London. What is singular about European money capital was its rise and its establishment of hegemony. For the first time, Karl Marx regards this kind of hegemony of capital as something positive and speaks of its favorable and progressive role in shaping modernity. Emanuel Wallerstein likens this hegemony to a lion breaking out of its cage, but he also feels the need to emphasize that its role is positive. When he links the emergence of the new hegemony to the weakening of the church and the kingdoms, as well as to the Mongol invasion developing in the East, it's as if he is confessing that he is faced with great question marks. Ultimately, he concludes that this was not the best course for history to take. This is not the place to present the horrifying balance sheet of the last 400-year reign of money capital. However, it is not difficult to understand the kind of hegemony we are up against if we consider the number of people who have died or been wounded in wars, the number and duration of these wars, the devastating consequences of economic crises, the rates of poverty and unemployment, and most importantly, its role in the ecological crisis. B. That the modernity that rests on capitalism is singular is insufficient and incorrect. Nonetheless, this assertion by the Eurocentric social sciences is quite comprehensive and all-encompassing. And it is not so different from previous civilizations in claiming that its existence as a world system and its all-encompassing reach mark the end of time and are the last word of truth. Furthermore, it makes this assertion even more absolute, using science as its weapon. Liberalism, having established its ideological hegemony, joins the media monopolies in claiming that this assertion is a common truth of all humanity. To this end, it makes an extraordinary effort to create ages within the age, that is, media age, the information age. Although it recognizes the importance of presenting the content and form of reality within its historical dimension, it does not refrain from constructing a futurology, detached from both the past and the present. It's amazingly concerned with the now, and instills an ethos of live the now, all else is meaningless, as a fundamental doctrine. Neoliberalism, formed from all sorts of old and new ideas and ideological templates with an eclectic approach, smacks of the decline of Rome, only much worse. We are in a period where the three S's, sports, sex, and art, Turkish sanat, have been maximally ideologized. All three have been given a religious dimension. It is really difficult to find another religion today that is more of an opiate than soccer, which has been transformed into a fiesta in the stadiums. We are seeing a similar development in the field of art, which has been transformed into an industry. The most basic of natural instincts, sexuality, has been turned into the sex industry. Sex, with its opiate effect, has also been transformed into a religion on par with sports and the arts. It might be more appropriate to refer to this triad as the religious celebrations, the fiesta of capitalist modernity. Even religious fundamentalism, which pursues the goal of the religious rule, is a current of modernity, no matter how anti-modern its facade. When examined in depth, it would seem that the modernity influenced by capitalism is the most insecure of modernities. Its need for such broad eclecticism proves this. Although postmodernism was a product of this insecurity, it failed to provide an alternative to modernity. Its only goal was to open a window for all those intellectuals who were sick of modernity. In terms of its way of life, it was deeply immersed in capitalist modernity. A typical example would be the philosopher Theodor Adorno, saying, "Wrong life cannot be lived rightly," in Minima Moralia. He explained modernity in a very clear and concise manner, but offered no alternative. This is among the reasons why the revolutionary youth turned against him. Neoliberalism actually wanted to renew the flaking varnish of modernity. But despite its add-ons and innovations, whitewashing the contradictions of the age of global financial monopoly and saving the system is no easy task. Andre Gunder Frank came very close to discovering the truth when he determined the role and importance of European civilization within the 5,000-year-old civilizational process. But he also profoundly regretted that, apart from some generalities, he could not develop and present an alternative or any solutions. But he retained hope. The formula of unity in diversity within the classical civilization is a correct but extreme generalization. There is no explanation offered of how to achieve this. His error, however, is the hope that a better and different modern life is possible within the system. Emanuel Wallerstein is positive and radical in this regard. He does not believe in a solution within the system. He repeats tirelessly that the current crisis is systemic and structural, and suggests that we devote ourselves wholeheartedly to the intellectual, moral, and political tasks that he correctly defines. His shortcoming, however, is that he does not present a comprehensive answer to the question of what kind of system. However, he offers a sincere self-criticism when he says, "We have all drunk from the same cups in the sacred temple of the bourgeoisie." At the same time as he metaphorically expresses his fear of the wrath of the gods, he talks about the ways in which intellectual capital is strongly dependent on capitalist modernity, and how difficult it is to make a radical break. In short, he makes many points that provide necessary lessons. On the other hand, my situation is best expressed in the saying, "It is of no use to try to escape death." I fled from capitalist modernity, but this flight was not enough to escape its clutches. Therefore, instead of dying in its clutches, I decided that trying out the alternative would be more realistic and courageous. Thus, I was neither content with speaking the truth like Nietzsche, or announcing the death of humanity like Michael Foucault. Nor, like Theodore Adorno, did I resign myself to fate, sulking and saying what cannot be cured must be endured. I also did not find it sufficient to seek shelter under the slogan, unity in diversity. Moreover, contrary to Immanuel Wallerstein, I do not believe that it was sufficient to determine the importance of the intellectual, moral, and political tasks. However, these people of thought and virtue have without a doubt made significant contributions to this attempt of mine and gave me courage. However, wrong life cannot be lived rightly is not something that could have been true for me. I never lived that way. I ran after it a lot, but neither my strength nor my faith was enough to grasp the capitalist modern life. But what is more searing is that the human who rebelled within me kept saying, "Don't sell us out. Whatever you seek, find it within yourself." I am writing about my rebellions. One might ask, what can you do about the triad of forces of modernity that have taken root in every mind and soul for 5,000 years, and in the last 400 years have seized every social value, whether inside or outside, from the highest layers of the air to the deepest layers of the earth, turning them into commodities to be bought and sold, and which have become 1,000,000 times stronger than the orders of the Nimrods and the Pharaohs? But of course, I am posing the question incorrectly, in a way that modernity wants. What I hope to show is that there is no positive value to such a question, or the construct that lies behind it. I have neither discovered nor invented democratic modernity, although I have a few things to say about its reconstruction that is not terribly important. To be more precise, the real important point lies elsewhere, and that is that democratic modernity has been dichotomous since the emergence of official civilization, whenever and wherever it arose. What I'm trying to do, even if only in broad terms, is to give due recognition to this form of civilization that exists wherever and whenever official civilization exists, and to meaningfully clarify its main dimensions in a way that arouses interest. Additionally, I will try to understand and define its basic forms of mentality, structures, and living society. There is nothing incomprehensible about the fact that whenever and wherever the supposedly singular civilization existed, a counterpart has necessarily existed for dialectical reasons. It is rather incomprehensible that this natural consequence of the dialectical method has not been systematically expressed throughout the history of civilization and has not been given a voice. From Sumer to Egypt and Harappa, from China to India and Rome, when all these civilizations took form, was there no reaction, no ideas, and no social structures among the numerous tribes, ashirets, and religious communities that were oppressed and enslaved, but who rebelled from the Great Sahara to the deserts of Central Asia and from Siberia to Arabia? Could it be possible that nobody thought of this? Is it really possible that the agrarian village communities fed all civilizations for 10,000 years, but never raised their voices, never reacted, and never had counterstructures? Is that conceivable? Is it just? If they were exposed to all sorts of repression and exploitation by the rulers of the cities that they had built with their own hands for thousands of years, would the working peoples sit there quietly and be grateful for their fate? Is that really possible? It is possible to ask thousands of questions about different areas and periods, and there are answers. What is missing is the weaving of a system of civilization from the answers to these questions. There are also counterstructures. The level of interest shown for the despotic, imperial, and power and capital monopolies is not shown for the situation and development of moral and political society, the basic state of social nature. Take Islamic civilization, with which I am quite familiar. Even the most minute details are recounted in the extensive stories of the caliphs, sultans, emirs, and sheikhs, but the stories of the believers, sects, and denominations spread across 3 continents, and their resistance, longings, and convictions are either not deemed worthy of a similar treatment or are distorted. Clearly, there is an internal conflict and dichotomy within civilization, but while one side is exalted by boundless praise, its opponents are abased. I have witnessed this myself. I have observed Alevi Kurds, Sunni Kurds, and Yazidi Kurds. I can unequivocally say that the civilization of the Alevi and Yazidi Kurds, distilled over thousands of years, is more moral and political than the counter-civilization. But the classical discourses of civilization are full of unspeakable slanders against the Alevis and Yazidis. Of course, when I say that, I'm not talking about the laborers or tribal and Ashiret cultures that belong to the Sunni faith. All these social sectors are part of democratic civilization. Examples of this can be shown at all times and in all places, but this will suffice to explain what I mean. It is important to clarify another point about modernity. In a way, the term capitalist modernity is incorrect, and it should be noted that I use the concept conditionally. If the concept of capitalist society is ambiguous and risks obscuring reality, this is even more true of the concept of capitalist modernity. Modernity in general is a given era's social way of life. It is the material and immaterial culture that contains all the elements of technology, science, art, politics, and fashion that shape a certain period. In this sense, it is a grave mistake to attribute modernity to capitalism. In fact, many of its elements are overwhelmingly opposed to capitalism, which is essentially a monopoly. Moral and political society, which is social nature's main mode of life, is opposed to civilization in general, and to capitalist civilization in particular. So it holds a similar position in modernity. Modern society is not a capitalist society. So why do I use the term capitalist modernity? Because capitalist monopoly and its hegemonic allies would like to shape not only society, but the modernity that is understood to be the way of life of this particular time. Together with its ideological, political, and military allies, it systematically drives through education, military barracks, places of worship, and the media to appear to be the creative force of the era's way of life. It creates a dominant mentality that reflects ownership of what does not belong to it. If its propaganda effort has been successful, then it has shaped society or modernity. Anthony Giddens most probably does not realize that he is caught in a dilemma when he considers capitalism to be the most important pillar of modernity. The crucial question is, which gave rise to or determines the other? It is unthinkable that modernity gave rise to capitalism. Modernity is lived as an era specific to social nature. But when oppressive and exploitative monopolies took the form of the city, the class, and the state, they tried to shape the way of life of that period and take credit for its development. We have to admit that they were mostly successful, but it was a propaganda success. An entire era has been attributed to imposters. When using the concept of capitalist modernity, we should always keep this in mind. But social nature never totally adopts the colors or way of existence of capitalism or any other monopoly as its own identity. It is also impossible for social nature, as selfhoods, to transform into a network of oppressive and exploitative monopolies. Just as we have shown that pure capitalism is impossible, it is also impossible to realize a pure civilization. We should ask those who think it is, when there remains no society to exploit and rule, how will the city, the class, and the state live on as they are? How will they even maintain something as basic as their material life? That, however, doesn't mean they can't shape and exploit the social nature of the period. If we speak of Europe, for example, we cannot attribute the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment to capitalism. The creators of the Renaissance were not the owners of money capital, and the rulers, who nonetheless hoped to use their money and their power to leave their mark on it, knowing they would earn even more money and power if they were successful. Its counterpart, society, which is targeted by money capital and the rulers, can also leave its mark on the way of life of an age. And there are a variety of examples of the various ways it has done so. The selfhood of social nature also tends in this direction. Society is overwhelmingly anti-capitalist because it experiences the exploitation and domination of capitalist monopoly on a daily basis. Youth, women, the unemployed, colonized people, many religious communities, and all communities that live off their own labor are the main block of historical society that give the way of life, the modernity of an era, its true color. As a matter of convenience, we call all of these and similar groups the demos. Democracy is the expression of self-governance of all these groups. Although these are political concepts, democratic society and democratic modernity are closer to its essence, because the realm of the groups they cover constitute the main block of society. Therefore, I ask that you bear with my frequent use of these terms. When I speak of the option of democratic modernity, this is what I mean. Therefore, both the concepts of a singular modernity and of modernity influenced by capitalism are quite dubious and contain a high likelihood of error. What will determine any given modernity's color are the ideas, structures, and struggles of its opposing poles and the extent of their success. To call either pole entirely capitalist or entirely democratic is to fall into blind and crude reductionism. In any case, when we talk about society, we should use the concept of entirely sparingly. Social nature is complex and never corresponds entirely to one thing or one color. We must not forget that contradictions require differences. Diversity is the meaning of life. The end of contradiction and differentiation would spell the end of life. Even death is nothing but proof of life. Can you imagine, for example, a life that has been condemned to last an eternity, a life with no death? Such a life would be great torture. If it is not for the purpose of crushing opponents, seeking similarity at all times is the negation of life. The efforts of fascism or capitalist modernity to liquidate all social differences and reduce them to a single color is more proof of its hostility to life. In conclusion, although we describe modernity as a dubious concept, it is nonetheless important to determine its scope and duration. Reducing it to singularity is rife with serious errors. Describing modernity as contemporary, as the present of the civilization, requires us to make careful choices about its social context. The sweeping shortcomings and errors of the social sciences in this respect are obvious. We can best explain this by the pressure of the capital and power monopolies and the money on which these sciences depend. Science breeds power, and power breeds capital But the inverse is also true. Despite this, the main block of social nature remains democratic in the age of capitalist hegemony. Therefore, there is no reason to believe that modernity, which is the era's way of life, cannot be democratized. The social scope of democratic modernity exceeds that of the modernity of the capitalists and their collaborators many times over. To understand this, we only have to learn to think correctly.